Bonjour, French one. Today we are going to learn about some ER verbs that have a slight exception to what I taught you earlier in the year. Specifically, ER verbs that have the letter G right before the ER. We call them GER verbs. And ER verbs that actually have the letter C before the ER, also known as CER verbs. So basically what we'll do is we'll backtrack and talk about the exact same thing that we talked about in the beginning of the year as far as how ER verbs work. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a new dimension to it by telling you about the exceptions to the rule. So all of this should look really familiar to you because we talked about this way back in the fall. An ER verb is, of course, a verb as in an action word that ends in the letters ER. And you have to change those ER endings to make them match the subject because verbs agree with their subjects. You don't want to sound silly and say things like I swims or he swim, that kind of thing. So anyway, in order to do that, you have to know your subject pronouns. Again, I know I'm going quickly here, but it's because none of this is anything new to you. The je, for the word je, means I, tu means you, il means he, elle means she, nous means we, vous means either y'all or you formal, as in you, Dr. Strong, and ils and elles mean they. So having told you all of that, of course, when you want to change an ER verb, you drop the ER and you add those ER endings. And each subject pronoun has its own ending that you add, just like how in English you say I swim, but he swims, and we add the letter S to it. There's different endings to make them match the subjects. And in French, those endings are the letter E for the je form, the letters ES for the tu form, the letter E for the il and elle form, the letters O and S for the nous form, EZ for the vous form, and ENT for the ils and elles form. Again, if I've gone too fast, you can pause this and rewind, but this is all stuff we've covered before, so onward. So just to give you a quick example, just like we did in the fall, if you wanted to conjugate the verb aimer, which is the verb for to like, and of course it is indeed an ER verb because see how it ends in the letters ER. If you wanted to say something such as I like and use it with the subject pronoun je, you would drop the ER off of aimer, leaving you with that AIM stem, and you would add the right ending for je. So the way you say I like is by saying j'aime with the E ending. If instead you wanted to say you like, I understand that it doesn't change in English, but in French the endings are slightly different than they are in English. To do the you form of like, you have to drop off the ER, and you have to add the tu ending, which is an ES for tu aime. To say he or she likes, again, in English we add an S, but in French all of these endings are different, so you have to memorize that the he and she form, after dropping the ER, has letter E added to it. Il aime or elle aime is either he likes or she likes. To say we like, we drop off the ER and add the nous ending, which is O and S, nous aimons. To say y'all like, you drop off the ER and add that EZ ending for vous, which is vous aimez. And to say they like, you drop off the ER and add the ils and elles ending, which is ENT. Again, that is ils and elles M. Doesn't pronounce the ENT. You'll remember back in the fall, we talked about how there was a really cheesy song to memorize those endings. Again, the song itself has no meaning. It's just literally the endings in order according to the verb chart to a very annoying tune of Frere Jacques. So one more time, that song is S, S, O-N-S, O-N-S, O-Z, 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 O-N-T, O-N-T. Again, remember I am pronouncing this in the French way, so the E is pronounced and the Z is pronounced Z and all that good stuff. And as always, we learned a whole list of ER verbs that you can apply this rule to. We learned écouter, which is to listen, téléphoner, which is to call, travailler, which is not to travel, it's to work, regarder, which is to watch, adorer, which is to love, and étudier, which is to study. And you'll notice that they all end in an ER. And that's pretty much where our lesson ended before. But now I have a little, lie to clear up, and that is that rule applies to every single verb that ends in an ER, because in fact, it doesn't. And in fact, there are two types of verbs we want to talk about today that have a slight spelling change, but it's a very, very minor issue, and that's why we don't teach it to you right off the bat. It's easier to just say that this rule applies all the time than to actually give you the exceptions right off the bat. The first exception occurs with what we are going to call CER verbs, verbs that happen to have a C before the ER. And don't worry, I'll give you some lists of those verbs here in a second. For now, we're starting with the word commencer, which is to start something. Commencer has a C before the ER, and there's a really weird exception, and it only occurs in one of the forms. So on all the other forms, you drop the ER and you add the endings just like normal. But in the news form, you have to actually add that cédille. So I'm actually drawing the shape here. That cédille is that accent mark that hangs below the C. We saw it on ça va. It makes the C have an S sound. Whenever you are doing the news form of a CER verb, only the news form, none of the others, everything else is exactly as I've always taught you, you have to add that cédille. That's just so that it doesn't sound weird. You wouldn't want to be saying je commence, tu commences, il commence, and then say comment quand, which is how a French person would read this if it didn't have the cédille hanging off it to make it have a S sound instead of a K sound. So again, nous commençons, you have to have that accent mark in the news form of a CER verb, means that we are starting or we start to do something, such as nous commençons à travailler, we start to work or we are starting to work. GER verbs also have a slight exception, and that is that in the news form only, you actually don't drop both the E and the R. You actually just drop the R, and you have to leave that E in there. So if you want to say something like we are eating, I went ahead and let you make the mistake earlier in the year, but from here on out, so that you're not pronouncing it wrong and saying je mange, tu manges, il mange in French, so that this is not mangeons with a hard G sound, they actually leave the E in there, and that makes it nous mangeons. I know as an English speaker you can say, well, I would pronounce that mangeons, and that's no problem whether there's an E in there or not. But for a French speaker, you have to actually have that E in there to make it change the pronunciation of the G. So again, really the only exceptions are with CER and GER verbs in the news form. If it's not a CER, if it's not a GER, or if it's not in the news form, do ER verbs exactly as you always learn them. But we are going to add a whole host of verbs to your list of things you should know in this chapter, and a lot of these are GER and CER verbs. So you need to be aware of these exceptions so that when you deal with these particular verbs, you know that in the news form there's the weird thing of on the CERs you add the accent mark, on the GERs you leave the E's in there, only on the news form. I know I'm saying it over and over again. It's because most of this stuff is nothing new to you. So again, some GER verbs. Changer, which is to change. Échanger, which is to exchange. Corriger, which is to correct. Déranger, which is to move or disturb something. Sorry, there's a typo there. It should be a T in there. Encourager, which is to encourage. And voyager, which is to travel. So most of these would react the same as we've always learned. You drop the ER, you add the S. The only difference is in the news form of all of these GER verbs, you actually leave the E before the O and S. Over here, I've got some CER verbs for you. Placer is to place or to put something somewhere. Prononcer is to pronounce. Remplacer is to move or to replace something depending on the situation. Avancer is to advance something or to move it forward. So a person can avancer, a person can advance or move forward towards somebody else. And lancer is like to launch something or to throw it. Again, these would all react just as normal ER verbs were in the je form, the tu form, the il form. You'd add your s, and your It's only in the news form that you will have to actually drop that cédille onto the C's to make those C's a s sound instead of a k sound. So real quick, let's try some examples. So the news form of écouter. Notice that it is not a CER or a GER, so it's a regular ER, which means you drop off the ER, you add the news ending, which is O and S. Nous écoutons de la musique, as we listen to music. Now, déranger, you should right away notice it's a GER verb, but as soon as you notice that, double check and see if you're talking about the news form. Because if you're not talking about the news form, you're not doing anything different. You're dropping the ER, you're adding the right ending for the il form, which is the letter E. Il dérange la classe is he disturbs the class. Nothing different about that. So when I see this one and I see CER, automatically I'm going, wait a second, CERs are a little strange if they're in the news form. How about that? It's in the news form. So folks, I go ahead and start treating it the same. I drop off the ER, I add the O and S. But the little thing that you have to do different about CERs in the news form is you have to add that very teeny tiny accent mark that's there. All right, well, here's regarder. You'll notice it's not a CER, it's not a GER, so even though it's in the news form, it's not going to throw me off at all. I'm going to drop the ER, I'm going to add my O and S, and I'm not going to worry because it's not a CER and it's not a GER. Nous regardons la télé as we watch TV. Same thing with this one. It's not a CER, it's not a GER. I could have done this back in September. Drop off the ER, add the ENT because ils is my subject. Il parle avec des amis. They are talking with some friends. Chante, not a GER, not a CER. Again, could have done this a long time ago. Drop off the ER, add the letter E ending for my je subject. Je chante bien, I sing well. Now on this one, voyager, there's a GER, so I'm automatically on high alert. I double check the subject. It is indeed news, which means that after dropping the ER and before adding the ONS, I actually leave that E back in there, and that's a weird exception to the rule because it's a GER with news. And then finally, with the L's form of MA, same thing as normal. It's not a GER, it's not a CER. I drop the ER, I add that E ending for the L form. Elle n'aime pas la musique classique. She doesn't like classical music. I believe we've talked about these before, but just a quick little reminder about negation. In order to say that you don't do or like something, you have to add in those words ne and pas, and you always put them around the verb. The verb is whatever the ending change occurred on. So if you, instead of saying nous aimons le français, we like French, wanted to say we don't like French, it would be nous n'aimons pas le français. Notice how the E gets dropped off the ne whenever it's backed up against the vowel. If you happen to have two vowels in a sentence, such as I like to read, like and to read both being verbs, then you only change the ending on the first verb that's in the sentence. And that would be, in this case, he likes to watch TV. You don't have to drop the ER and add the E on both MA and regarder. You only change the first one. But again, those are things we've talked about earlier in the year. So come ready to work with those news forms of GER and CER verbs next class.